Okay, hello together and welcome back to our philosophy show. So Christoffer and I have decided to talk today about an interesting idea that Nietzsche, I think, kind of expressed, or I don't know if he was the first to express it, but at least it's kind of attributed to him. And that is the question whether behind each philosophy there is some kind of emotional desire in the end that makes the philosopher hold this philosophy. So I think Nietzsche said that behind each philosophy we see the desire of the philosopher. And what he meant by that is, for example, some people tend to explain all social dynamics through power. They say, well, everything is basically just an expression of power. And what Nietzsche would say is, well, okay, that if they hold this philosophy, then that also gives them the legitimacy to use power themselves. Because if everything is just power, then also I myself am just using power. Or another example would be Freud's philosophy that basically explains all social acts or interactions based on sexuality. And so again, if you yourself just are very, what's the right word, enamored of sexuality, then you might make this as the basis of your philosophy, because then you are justified in acting it out. And so, yes, I think this is Nietzsche's theory. And as you expressed before, Christoffer, I think you don't agree with it, but I will let you explain this yourself.
Thank you, Amos. Yes, first of all, it's interesting that this idea of Friedrich Nietzsche is very similar. I would say it's the exact same idea fundamentally, as we also see in the thoughts of Marxism and modern radical leftism. Because in Marxism, we see this idea that those economists who put forward arguments for a free market economy, actually it's just their bourgeois mentality or their capitalistic mentality imposing their oppression of the workers in a form of arguments. And you could say that this is also happening with radical leftism today, where they discredit arguments for Western civilization or conservatism or Christianity as being racist or colonialist logic or something like that, and ignoring the content and the soundness and logic of arguments and positions themselves. So yes, I would completely disagree with that notion, because we human beings, as is evident to everyone, every adult, we have the capacity for reason. We can understand and comprehend things through a purely logical way. Every time we do mathematics, we do that very obviously. Every time we evaluate an argument and try to identify logical fallacies in a position or argument, we do that. So we are able to separate logic from purely irrational forces. Now, it is very true that human beings are very often guided by irrational forces, by certain desires that are not rational and biases and all that. And I think this is a very powerful and huge factor in driving what human beings believe, unfortunately. However, this doesn't mean that human reasoning itself is subject to it. It only means that we are weak and we aren't always doing what our mind is supposed to do, namely reasoning logically. So I would say that we can reason, we can use logic completely independently of irrational forces. However, that is a challenge that we have to face. We have to try to master our own weaknesses and look for truth, have a love for truth itself, and not be blinded or clouded by irrational things like pride or confirmation bias or fear or bodily desires, etc. So yeah, those are my initial remarks to this in this idea.
Interesting. Thank you very much. So, and I think also it's a good point that you brought up here, that human beings have the faculty of reason, and they are, or at least, yeah, they are able to judge an argument based on logic and not just based on emotion. And as you said, that can be very difficult because people can, of course, be strongly motivated by things that they want or don't want, which comes from the emotions. But as you say, we are in theory capable of judging the rationality or the logical truth or falsehood of an argument, irrespective of how it affects us personally. Is that, I think, your point?
Yes.
Yes, and I would very much agree that we can do this, and also that we should do this. And I think Nietzsche would agree with that as well. I think his point is not that people basically do not have the faculty of reason or cannot discern rational arguments. I think it goes deeper, because perhaps it goes a little bit into the direction of what things do we hold as axioms, because every theory, as we have, I think, talked about also in previous conversations, every theory or every philosophy rests on certain axioms. And which axioms you choose, there are certain axioms which are contradictory in themselves, so logic could rule these out. And there are certain axioms which seem very difficult to maintain because they directly contradict certain things that we experience in reality, and they are also difficult to maintain or can be ruled out. But then still we are left with different axioms, which I think it might be very hard or even impossible to prove which of them is correct. That's why we call them axioms, because we kind of take them as the starting point of our reasoning. And the philosophy, of course, follows to a large extent from these axioms. And which axioms a person would hold might therefore still depend on their emotions or desires or fears.
Interesting points. Well, when it comes to the role of axioms in a theory, I am sort of skeptical to what role they actually play. So I would perhaps, I have thought of this idea that a position or a theory, an intellectual position or theory, could be understood as a composite of form and matter. Now, you might perhaps remember form and matter from Aristotle's idea of hylomorphism in order to analyze a material object. But I think this principle can be very useful in understanding theories, so we are understanding form and matter in a more abstract way. So in a theory and a position, you have the form and the matter. The matter is the content of the theory or position. It is some aspect of reality to which the theory or position is referring. And then you have the form, which is the logic, the logical analysis, which argues for the position or brings together the content of it to this logical idea. So for instance, let's take the general truth that human beings are by nature social animals. Perhaps we call this an example, an easy example of a theory or position. This has form and matter in the sense that the matter, the content, is human beings and the idea of sociality, the idea of beings socially interacting with each other. Both of these things we know through experience. We are human beings ourselves and we interact with other human beings, so we comprehend human beings as part of reality. And we comprehend sociality. We are social ourselves, we engage in social interaction, we fully understand it. It's part of reality that we observe and interact with. And then the form is the logic we use to make this theory. For instance, the principle of essentialism, the idea that beings have an essence and that things act according to their essence. And when we can see a general tendency of a certain kind of being doing certain things, that's a sign of their essence. So we see human beings generally socialized, hence we can rationally conclude that human beings are by nature animals. So I'm not sure where I would place the idea of axioms in this example. Perhaps you could say that, well, the philosophical principle of essentialism, the idea of things having a nature or essence, is an axiom. But I would see it as us just realizing that beings must have essence. It's just part of what beings are. It's a recognition of a metaphysical part of reality. And then the matter of the theory, human beings, sociality, you could say that I'm not sure if I would call those axioms either, because yes, they are there and we just accept it, but we accept it on the basis of us acknowledging it or receiving information about it from our own experience of us human beings and interacting with others. So yes, that was it. I would understand the idea of positions or theories and perhaps even arguments in this sense, rather than basing it off on certain axioms, perhaps. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but that's at least my thoughts.
Yes, no, it does make sense. And I think it's an interesting example that you brought up here, that you say, well, both the existence of human beings and also the existence or the fact that they have sociality is a thing that we observe in reality. And so therefore, where exactly is the axiom? I think one place where the axiom, of course, is in the metaphysical assumptions, in the assumptions what is reality made of. There, I think always there are axioms somewhere in this question, because you have to assume or you have to have some idea of what reality is made of, but it's hard to prove either or. So for example, is it made just of atoms, or is it made just kind of, we all live in the dream of a giant frog? I mean, these things are not really, can't be proven in a sense. So that's one place where the axioms are. And another place where they are, I think, has to do with, would be in the end in what you called the form of the theory. Because, so we have the matter, which is, for example, we look at human beings and we try to explain their behavior. And then we have the form. And so when we talk about human beings, in some way or another, we would have to talk about their internal processes. Like some people say, well, all human beings are motivated just by procreation. So the sexual drive is what motivates human behavior. And then they continue to explain all different forms of behavior as basically sexual in nature. So for example, the child clings to the mother because it is sexually attracted to her, or when, I don't know, when someone enjoys throwing a spear, then he thinks of penetrating the target or something like that. So you can draw all kinds of theories up like that. Or you can say, for example, no, human beings are in their essence altruistic, and so even when they violently conquer another country, it's just because they want to bring their better form of government there. I don't know. So in these, how you explain the things that you observe in reality, sometimes in this theory there are also certain starting points which can't really be reduced further in the theory itself.
Well, I would sort of agree that in a theory, in the form of the theory, and in a sense you could say the matter of the theory as well, is fundamentally based on some principles which you cannot prove by showing forth an even deeper principle. For instance, the principle of essentialism, that things have essences. I imagine you could argue for that in several ways, but even in that you reach a certain deepness of metaphysics that you simply just have to recognize as being true. And that this is obviously true of the laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction, that you cannot have A and not A at the same time in the same way. How are we going to prove that? Well, it's just true in itself by virtue of itself. So I would say that it's self-proven. It's not proven by virtue of something else, it's proven intrinsically, intrinsic to the thing itself. So I would not exactly call them necessarily axioms, because you can have certain principles which are foundational. We cannot ground them in something perhaps even deeper, but the proof or the evidence for it being true is intrinsic to the thing itself, like the laws of logic. We just immediately realize that it's true in itself. And I would perhaps say the same thing about several other metaphysical principles, what we call metaphysical assumptions. I would say something stronger than assumptions. I would say principles, because I think that we can actually have a rational basis of believing those principles, not because we necessarily can prove them on some even deeper basis, but because our minds simply immediately recognize them to be logical and rational and true. So yes, that is a remark I would have to that. I could address your hypothetical examples of the role of reproduction as an intention behind different actions, but perhaps we can dive more into that later if you want to comment on what I just said right now.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we could remain on this question here of what an axiom is a little bit longer. I think that would be useful. And I like you bringing up the laws of logic, because the laws of logic are, from the discipline of logic, from that point of view, they are axioms. They are and as you call them, the principles which are just set as a starting point, and then logic is built on top of that. And as you said, which I think is a very good way of identifying an axiom in one's own mind or in the theory of another, it is a statement that is presented as being self-evident. So I guess you know the experience. Sometimes you argue with someone about something, you have some philosophical debate, and the person will make a certain statement as if it were self-evident. But for me, in that case, for example, it is not self-evident at all. I might even disagree with it. But this person, in their mind, the statement is self-evident. Like an example could be, I don't know. For example, we had this vegan debate a couple of weeks ago, and Samuel said, human beings are, he didn't say it in that word, but the argument in other people have said they are like a cancer on the face of the earth. So wherever they go, they destroy the environment, they kill all the species, and this statement is said by environmentalists and also sometimes vegans as if it were self-evident. It's just look around, wherever you see human beings there, that's what they do. So that would, in my mind, be an example of a false axiom. And it could also be analyzed more deeply, and that's why I think it shouldn't be taken as an axiom. But I think that the point of being self-evident, I think that's exactly the question, because the question is now, are all human minds made so that they take the same statements to be self-evident, or do different human beings sometimes take different statements to be self-evident? And there could be a point where this Nietzschean question could kind of get in.
Well, what I would say is that the idea of something being self-evident is the idea that the idea is proven inherently or intrinsically, that the proof of that statement or idea is contained within a statement or idea itself. So we don't look for other things to prove the statement, because the statement itself is sufficient. It is its own proof. And that's why I think the laws of logic are a good example of this, because just by comprehending the idea of the law of non-contradiction, you immediately understand that it must be true, that you cannot have contradictions being true at the same time. So your mind realizes that it's true and necessarily true just by understanding the idea itself. So I think there is therefore an important and relevant distinction between something being self-evident and evident, generally speaking. So even the vegans, like Samuel, who would say that human beings are a cancer to this planet, and suppose that he thinks this is extremely obvious, that who could possibly disagree with this? Even so, I think he wouldn't say it's self-evident. It's not like just the idea of human beings being a cancer necessarily entails that they are, but rather he thinks that the evidence for that idea is so overwhelming it's almost impossible to avoid supposing that he believed that. So he would probably, or you could say he would argue that it's evident but not necessarily self-evident. So I would sort of make a distinction there. But yeah, so things are either self-evident, that means that the proof are contained within the idea itself, like the law of non-contradiction, in which case immediately when you understand the idea in your mind already knows that it must be true. And if you comprehend the idea and still say, well, I don't find it self-evident at all, then necessarily that person must be irrational or dishonest. Because just as you comprehend that the law of non-contradiction is true, or 1 + 1 = 2 is true, if you deny it after understanding the idea, well, there must be some bad will involved. So it's actually an interesting point, because you can argue that there is a philosophical proof that someone is acting irrational. So there we come back to Nietzsche and the idea of being irrational. If you can see that, well, actually he does comprehend something being true, but there is something irrational in their way. So that's the point of self-evident statements. Now, when it comes to things being true or proven to be true by virtue of external things, then yeah, you have to get into, okay, what is the evidence? Then you have to look for other things, like the statement, human beings are a cancer to this planet, because even vegans would agree, yes, this wouldn't be true intrinsically, but I appeal to some general body of evidence that science or a scientific journal has published. So yeah, those are some remarks I think are very important to this discussion.
Yes, thank you very much for this. I think this is a very good clarification that I will use from here on forward. So that when people say what people oftentimes mean is when they present a statement as just being evident but not self-evident. And what they mean is the evidence in reality is so overwhelming that who could deny that this statement is true? But what you said is that certain statements are self-evident in that they, when you understand them, you know them to be true. So I would like to think a little bit more about this. So I think also we had some, in past conversations, this idea has come up in some way or another. So for example, when we talked about contradictions, like someone says, you should not speak as a moral rule, then the moment, if he would actually follow this rule, then he wouldn't be speaking. So this cannot be, not doing the best job of explaining it. But, or let's take an even simpler example. Let's say, whatever. That which exists, exists. And so if you understand that something exists, then it must be true that it exists. So that would be a statement, if I understand you correctly, which would be self-evident.
Yes, if it exists, it exists. Like that, yeah.
Yes, or A is A. That's kind of a variant of that. So something is that which it is. It cannot be, yes, it cannot be denied. And also, for example, something cannot be that which is not, is also, yeah, so I see your point. So you're saying these things are when you have understood the statement, then you know it to be true kind of by itself. And therefore, you can't really deny it without being dishonest or being in some form, yeah, you called it bad will, which I think was also a very interesting point. So you would say that there are certain statements which are self-evident, and these cannot be. So this idea of Nietzsche that there is always a desire behind the philosophy, still every philosophy would have to accept these statements that are self-evident, because else it would just be dishonest or bad-willed.
You could say that.
So we could exclude self-evident statements from this Nietzschean statement.
Yes, because your mind just realizes that it must be true independently of your desires.
Yes, and probably we could also say that this self-evident statement would be self-evident to every human being who understands them. So there couldn't be a statement like A is A, and some person who is not crazy would not agree with this statement after he has understood it.
Yes, if he is rational and of goodwill, he could not possibly deny it.
Yes, yes. So either he would have to be, I think, crazy or kind of mentally handicapped in some severe way, or have a bad will if he disagreed with this statement. Okay, interesting. So then I think that would leave us with certain statements that some people take as evident. not self-evident, but evident. So, for example, all human interactions are based from the human drive to acquire power, or to a human drive of sexuality, or human desire to satisfy their own lust, or something like that. Which certain people say, well, look at the evidence. So they kind of take this statement to be obviously true by the fact that they observe these things in reality, but it wouldn't be self-evidently true.
Right, yes.
Good. And so we could then say that these axioms of which I was talking, of the axioms that are, in my mind, at the basis of a theory, would be things that this person takes to be evident from just the reality as they experience it.
Yeah.
And that could be a part of the matter or of the form of a theory. Like,
okay,
what are the components that the theory talks about? Like, yeah, there I'm not so sure, but certainly in the form, like this behavior is caused by that internal motivation, for example.
Yeah, so the idea is that they could argue that the overwhelming evidence might be contained in the form of a theory.
No, that the form of the theory is based on a statement which the theory holds axiomatically to be true, and this axiomatic statement is based on the overwhelming evidence in reality.
Yeah, perhaps we would need to analyze it further, because the idea of having evidence, I would argue, presupposes form and matter from the very beginning and onward. So perhaps if you could provide an example, that would be easier to discuss.
I always like to take some example that we have, that we kind of have personal connection to. So let's try, if we can, make an example out of our disagreement from the last conversation that we had about whether it's sometimes legitimate to oppose, or not to oppose, but to overthrow a government. That was the words that we used. And so the question, if it is sometimes legitimate to overthrow a government or not, when we talked about this question, we ended up, I think, by disagreeing about what makes a government legitimate. And I think I said that a government is legitimate insofar as it does what a government is supposed to do. And you said that a government is legitimate as long as it does what a government is supposed to do to a certain degree, which means more than not at all. And this, well, actually now this would be a difference in definition and not in an axiom, but perhaps we could construct an example of what we are discussing here about axioms, and perhaps if there is a motivation behind this axiom, at this example. What do you think?
We could examine my position and sort of see, okay, where's the axiom Where is the matter, where is the form, if that is what you had in mind?
Perhaps we could do that and also do it with my position, and then we could, perhaps that would lead us somewhere.
Right, yes. So I could attempt to present my theory in light of this analysis that we have been talking about. I'm not sure if I will do it successfully, but we can at least try. Because the idea is that governments, by virtue of being governments, that is the entity that is taking care of common goods in society, possess legitimate political authority. Or we could just say political authority, because I maintain that authority, as I understanding, is in itself legitimate. The idea of illegitimate authority is an oxymoron, that either we have authority or not, even though it's not that important. Perhaps it's just semantics, but anyways. So an entity taking care of common goods have this political authority. And that authority cannot be attacked by those who are subject to that authority, the citizens, you could say. You could say that, yes, a higher authority, like God, could depose of that authority, but not those who are subject to the authority of the government. So even if you have a government doing a lot of bad things, still by virtue of being government, by virtue of it having this authoritative relationship to the common goods of society, has this legitimacy. And you cannot attack that so long as it actually is a government, unless some higher authority says you can. So I would sort of suppose that the matter in this case is government, and the idea of overthrowing, and the idea of society and common goods are also very relevant. So those are the phenomena or realities that we know because we are part of society, we know them ourselves from reality. And then you have the form of the theory, which are these metaphysical principles, the principle of authority, the principle of what is morally legitimate and not legitimate, and fundamentally the idea of what is moral and not when it comes to, is it okay to take away something that is morally significant? And authority itself is morally significant. You cannot just attack it and take it away on your own initiative. So therefore, when we apply this form to this matter, government, overthrow, etc., we find a basis to say that no, overthrow is not okay from those subject to that authority. So we have the form, which are these metaphysical or ethical principles, and the matter, which is government, society, people. So yes, that was my attempt to analyze my theory.
Wow, it's complicated. I will try to stick with it. So you said that the matter of your theory are these entities like society and government, and actions like, and perhaps also a human or common good, and also the actions of overthrow or yeah, basically I think that was mostly it. So this is actually, no, that the action is something else, but just society, government, common good, perhaps individual. These are the matter of the theory. And then the form has to do with, basically it uses the concepts of authority and of moral legitimacy to describe the behavior between these entities.
Right. So you have the philosophy and you have the content of that theory, entity, government, yeah. So.
Yes, I was just thinking, because I think where we differed on this thing was perhaps even in the definition of authority, because or in the question of whether authority can be illegitimate or whether authority is always legitimate. I think, and in my mind, but I'm not sure if this is correct now that we are analyzing it in detail, but in my mind, it would seem that this statement of that authority is always legitimate, kind of by itself, it seems to me that you state this as an axiom, but correct me if I'm wrong. And it seems to me that I do not agree with this statement.
Which statement specifically?
That authority is always legitimate. Because in my mind, there can be also illegitimate authority. And therefore, at least, so now I'm wondering, is this because I have a different axiom than you, or because I find a different statement to be kind of evident from my experience of reality? So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's such a big difference. Some would perhaps say it's just a question of semantics, which words we use. That in your definition of authority, you include the notion of, no, you exclude the notion of legitimacy. So authority could be legitimate or illegitimate. But in my definition of authority, I include the notion of legitimacy. So we both understand authority and legitimacy. We just slightly categorize it differently, you could say. Sorry if I interrupted you.
No. That's an interesting point, because I think that definitions basically is very similar in the end to semantics. So if two people disagree on a definition, then they only disagree on which concept they associate with which word. But still, there should be a concept that, like, because reality is consistent, once we agree on the same concept, then even if I and you use a different word for it, we can still talk about it. And that would then be an example of just a semantic difference.
Right, I suppose so.
So perhaps in this example, what would you, if you know what I mean by illegitimate authority, how would you call that?
I would say it is an entity pretending to have authority and acting as if he has authority. That's the closest I can come right in the moment.
I see. Okay. Yes, I see. So, or I think that's interesting. So you would say that authority is kind of, by its definition, or authority is by its definition earned, or merited by some taking care of some human good, I think, as we talked about last time.
Well, to be precise, I would say not necessarily. One could receive authority as a pure gift, at least in theory. I would say that authority is a metaphysical reality. It's not simply the state of physical objects in a certain condition, like a group of people doing certain things. It's rather a moral reality. that is then applied to these physical things. So authority itself is metaphysical. Perhaps that's the difference, that you understand authority to be more the physical condition of this group of people, which acts as if it were government. But I understand authority to be this metaphysical principle. And therefore, morality, legitimacy is intrinsic to it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, perhaps that which I have called authority, I should rather call power from now on.
That's a very good point.
Yes, I think I will also take that to heart. What I have, and there I think you are right that authority is not the right word for it, but it's power.
Yes.
Power can be legitimate or illegitimate, I think.
Yes.
But when we talk about authority, then that has a different connotation with it. So far, I agree, but still, somewhere in your theory, you come to the conclusion that every government, by virtue of being government, has authority.
Yes.
And in that sense, now that we have defined the words more clearly, I would still disagree, because I feel there can also be a government Yeah, I'm just now wondering, but I'm wondering if it can be said that there can be a government that has no authority at all. I think that's probably your argument, that they, by virtue of being the government, they have some authority just because they are in this role.
Yes, the very essence of government is about taking care of common goods. Taking care of common goods, from that arises authority. So there is this essential connection.
I think I still can't really hold it apart in my mind, the concept of authority and the concept of power. I will have to think about this more. But I mean, if we go at it from the other end, we do differ in the conclusion whether it can be sometimes morally legitimate to overthrow a government. So somewhere there is a difference. And I'm not exactly sure where it is. I mean, you suggested last time that my approach might be a little bit consequentialist, so that I put more emphasis on the consequence of an action rather than on the principle which underlies it.
Yes, if I understand what you mean by principles underlying it, same way you do, I suppose so.
Mm-hmm. Whereas, because I think your position is that if something like authority is a moral good, then no matter how little authority there is in some entity, it's still immoral to actively abolish it.
Right, and if I can give a quick example of the same principle, you could say that as a morally responsible agent that human beings are, it's never okay for me to make you become morally corrupt. Let's say I encourage you and pressure you into lying, which I consider to be an immoral act. That would be wrong, not because I focus on the consequences of lying, but rather because you have this moral significant value, and that gives me an obligation to respect it and not attack it, irrespective of consequences of your actions. Similarly, I, as a morally responsible agent, cannot destroy a morally significant value like authority, irrespective of consequences. Even though I wouldn't say consequences are completely irrelevant to the entire discussion, but in this specific sense, we're talking about something prior to consequences.
So I'm thinking about the point where we started with Nietzsche and the desire being at the heart of every philosophy. And so it could be that one place where human beings can differ might be how much emphasis they put on consequence, on material consequences of actions, versus how much emphasis they put on what would you call this, moral or ethical principles. And this could be a whole spectrum where at the one end there is the philosophy of consequentialism that only cares about the material consequences. And on the other end, I'm not sure if this is correct, perhaps you can correct me, but on the other end, there would be something like deontology, where you have a certain set of rules that you just, this is the principle and you just follow it no matter what the consequences are.
Yeah, I would put it in a way that we have different metaphysical principles. What you call different emphasis, you could translate that into different metaphysical evaluations or values or principles. And one could say, well, why do we have these metaphysical differences? Could be because we have different desires. It is possible that I maintain my position because I really hate the idea of overthrow and I have bad experience with it or something like that, and I want to find an argument supporting my position. However, I do not believe that. I think I actually have a rational account of this position, and I think my idea of the idea of it being not lawful or legitimate to attack a legitimate authority, I think it's based on a rational account of ethics and metaphysics. So yeah, but yes, it's possible that some could adopt my theory out of some irrational desire, but I maintain that no, my position itself has some metaphysical basis to it. It's rational or reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that you feel this way, but I feel the same way about my position. So I also feel that I am maintaining, or that I maintain my position because it is rational and not just because, oh well, sometimes I wish to overthrow a government, so that's why I want to leave this option open. So yeah, so and also I think that this way of looking at it wouldn't do justice to the statement of Nietzsche. It would be kind of a straw man, because it mustn't be that the desire which underlies the theory is immediately that thing which the theory in a particular case allows for or denies, but it's more, let's say every human being has a world view. So they have a set of metaphysical assumptions, axioms, principles, call it what you may, and a set of, so they have a certain way of understanding the world and making sense of what they experience and classifying it and judging it. Is this good? Is this bad? Is this morally good? Is this evil? And so every person has this worldview, as I like to summarize it. And the first thing I think this Peterson talks about it is that you cannot live without a worldview, and you cannot just simply change it if you want to. So, and people will defend their worldview because they depend on it to function in reality, to make sense of all of these things that they experience all the time. And so one way of placing the desire could simply be to defend one's own worldview. But I think different worldviews call in certain circumstances different behaviors morally good or morally bad, or desirable or undesirable. And so I think it's more in a more removed step of the worldview where the desire that Nietzsche was talking about comes in. It's not just the desire to overthrow or to not overthrow, but it's more, yeah.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying there. And I also just had this thought that perhaps in a sense, you could say he's right, that desire is always there. Because even if you can imagine the purely rational man moved only by the logic of arguments, even he has a desire, the desire for truth. You could say that by the very act of reasoning, you are in that moment desiring truth. You're desiring to understand things as they actually are. And without that desire, you cannot even begin to reason, because reasoning implies the intention of reasoning. And the intention of reasoning implies the willingness or desire to find truth.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. So you could perhaps, I'm not sure, this is just a new thought, but I like this thought that you have put in my mind here. So you could say, for example, that some people have a desire for truth which is higher than all their other desires. And
Yes.
in other people, it might be a desire for like sex or lust or power, or simply ease, like having an easy life, not having to do any strainful activities. So and perhaps depending on which desire is higher in a person or stronger, then they would follow a different philosophy. That would be probably what Nietzsche would say. But still, the question is now, do they like, it's not the same as just acting on one's desire or having a philosophy that justifies acting in a certain way. And so I think what Nietzsche was getting at is that the hedonist doesn't just do whatever he pleases, but he also has a philosophy which says you should do whatever you please in the moment.
Right.
Whereas, for example, the person who values truth higher would say, no, you should strive towards the truth, no matter what your, let's call them, in Aristotelic term, animalistic desires, like food and sleep and hot and cold and all that stuff. So yes, and so, because I mean, there is this philosophy that says basically you should just maximize your sensual pleasure, and some people hold this philosophy. And so the interesting question would be, why do some people hold this philosophy and other people hold another philosophy, or like you and me.
Right. And you could say yes, bad will is one possibility, that they have some desire they want to rationalize instead of actually looking at, does it really make sense to have this philosophy? Yeah, so it could be desires of different sorts. And you also have this possibility of someone having a position or theory, not out of bad will, but simply because he's ignorant. He doesn't have all the relevant evidence in front of him. However, when it comes to philosophical positions that touch upon principles that are very intimate to us and something that we can very easily reason to, you could say it's difficult or perhaps even impossible to have error, to err in good faith, because the truth can be so intimate or immediate that it's impossible to avoid it in good faith, similar to how self-evident truths cannot possibly be denied in good faith unless you are absolutely crazy. So that's one point. So yes, some irrational desire would be relevant there. Now, one thing that I have thought about when it comes to Nietzsche, and this is more generally about him, he seems, as my impression is, he seems to try to discredit the idea of there being rational arguments about reality. It's my impression that he has this general idea that truth, objective truth, is false or something we should ignore, and that it's rather the will to power that matters. And this has been connected to postmodernism, the idea that objective truth is not attainable, it's all about power, which seems to me, again, to be related to Marxism and all this idea that we can simply discredit arguments because we can just automatically presume that it's based on irrational desires. So I'm not sure if he would mean desire in the sense that the desire of truth can be explained, because if you say, well, the rational man is driven by the desire for truth, then you can still say that his arguments are logical and tell us about reality. It seems to me that Nietzsche doesn't want that, he rather wants to discredit the idea of having access to objective reality itself. I haven't read Nietzsche personally, but that's my impression of what he believes.
Yes, interesting point that you brought up there, and I have read a little bit of Nietzsche, but not very much. But I would share your this estimation that you have given here from secondhand sources, basically, or from quotes that I have read here and there in other works, that he would, I think, not agree that there is such a thing as objective truth, that you can make a statement about reality which is objectively true or which you can objectively know to be true, which is not the same thing, but either one or both of these, I think he would disagree with. And of course, it's also interesting to apply Nietzsche's statement to himself, and as you correctly pointed out, also to the leftists and Marxists and postmodernists, which I think Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, that these philosophies, they seem to, or they, when you look at the philosophy, then in the end their statement is there is no truth, there is only power. And of course this in a sense legitimizes them to lie and to do whatever they can to achieve power themselves. Because if there is nothing else than power, then they as a group or as individuals are legitimized in acting and doing everything they can to achieve power, because there is nothing else other than power. And I don't know enough about Nietzsche to want to make the same statement about him, but the question at least can be asked, well, if everything is the will to power, then perhaps it's just also says something about Nietzsche himself, that he would make such a philosophy, but that would actually be a confirmation of his statement.
You mean his lifestyle?
No, if we say, well, Nietzsche just maintains this theory because he himself likes to have power, then the statement that behind every philosophy there is the desire of the philosopher would be confirmed by Nietzsche himself.
Right, or it could be something more elaborate, like in his past he idealized some figure, like one of the old figures in some classical Greek poetry. He used to watch something like that at some place, and he was fascinated by something that they did, and from that he was fascinated by the idea of your will to power, and he wanted to keep on to that ideal which he loved and was fascinated by. So he tried to come up with a philosophy. So that's an example of something that might have motivated him. But yeah.
Yes, and I think the idea is not that a person consciously decides to come up with a philosophy that justifies the thing which they desire. But the idea is just that your desire subconsciously affects what statement you hold as evident based on your experience, or what form you use in your theory to explain the interaction of different entities that you are observing. That it's not a conscious construction of a philosophy, but it's more just you are in the end guided by your desire subconsciously to just reach a certain philosophy, which you then hold as true because it seems evident to you. It seems to explain the way you experience the world, and that's why then you think that this philosophy is true. And yeah.
Right, and one formulation of this principle that I like is that your judgment about reality could be clouded by vices, by pride, or by confirmation bias, or lust, or something like that, and you might not even realize it. And I think this also is something that Christianity alludes to in scripture, when it's talking about those who reject the gospel and certain people being blind to the truth, that they're somehow clouded by sinful desires and things like that. So that's also interesting to consider.
Yes, I think that's interesting, because I wanted to comment that I really like this thing that you said, that basically it could be bad will or ignorance could be the reason why someone falls from the truth, let's call it that way. If there is an objective truth, and if it's possible to know it at least to a certain extent, which both of them I believe, then it would be either through bad will or ignorance that someone would fall short of this.
Right.
And this is very interesting, because we have talked about in previous conversations that which makes a human being distinctly human instead of an animal is rationality, and rationality is composed of the will and of the intellect. So the faculty of understanding logical causes and effects, and the faculty of wanting something. And so here we found again that these two things can fall short of the ideal, and then somebody will not see something which is objectively true. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at.
Mm-hmm. And so the interesting question in my mind now concerning this statement of Nietzsche would be, and I also see what your point is, because if there is an objective truth that can be known at least to a degree, then the only reason why someone would hold a position that differs from the true position is either because he hasn't yet understood the error, or he has actively not wanted to understand it based on some, as you call, sinful desire or bad desire or something like that.
Right.
Which I think is also something that I agree with. And so I'm in the troublesome position that I agree with that statement, and I also agree with Nietzsche's statement. And because I believe that human beings are different, and therefore they experience the world or the evidence of reality differently and come to perhaps different conclusions, not by bad will and not by ignorance, though many times I think bad will is actually the largest part of the problem. But still, I think there is also the possibility just that our minds are not identical, and therefore differences can also occur without bad will. Or yeah, so perhaps that's a way of bringing both together.
You could also say that suppose you have two rational people, and they're both of good will, that desire truth, and their judgments are not clouded by irrational desire, and they had access to the same information about reality, they would come to the same conclusions.
Interesting point. Yes, interesting idea that you brought up there, because of course we all have not access to the same information, but to different information. Because I have my past that I have accumulated experience, and you have yours, and other people have theirs.
Right. And you could have one who is slower to reach a conclusion because he has to think about it to understand the logic behind an argument. But if he's completely irrational and not of bad will, then he wouldn't reach a conclusion that contradicts the other one. He would just not give a conclusion yet because he still has to understand what he has in front of him. But yeah.
There, I'm not sure. I have seen once this great picture, which I will put in the video. Or no, actually, I can explain it while we are in the video. So because what I'm trying to get at is that thing that you said would be correct if reality was, let's say, of the same order of magnitude of complexity as that which I perceive from it. But I perceive only a tiny fraction of reality. And another person also only perceives a tiny fraction from reality. And therefore, these fractions could seem to contradict each other because there is a larger overarching structure that neither one of them has understood. So let's take an example. When you have this object here, which is just a kind of a cylinder. Now, if you look at it exactly from this perspective, then it looks like a circle. And if you look at it exactly from this perspective, it looks like a rectangle. And so when two people look at this from different perspective, one could say it's a circle and the other could say it's a rectangle. But because reality is more complex than we can understand, do you see what I'm trying to get at?
I think so, but even in the example of one seeing a circle and the other triangle, they could still say that, well, what I see is a circle, but it's possible that the thing is in front of me actually has some dimensions that another person could see as a triangle or a rectangle from his perspective. So if one person is open to his position being consistent with his other person's position, you could say that, well, it's not necessarily a contradiction though.
Yes, that's true. The problem is that, and perhaps here we are getting also at something interesting in correlation with our general discussion, that in reality, sometimes for a human being, it can be difficult to perceive the possibility of there being further dimensions than they perceive themselves. Because of course, we know that the material space has 3 dimensions, and therefore when you see a flat surface, it's not very astonishing that there might be a 3rd dimension. But and we could look at these things that we have been talking about all the time, like truth or lust or power or comfort, I don't know, like these fundamental human drives. Perhaps we could look at these like dimensions that motivate human action. And so different kind of, I feel like a primitive philosophy only takes into account 1 or 2 of these dimensions, and a better rounded philosophy would take into account all of these dimensions.
As motivations for human action?
Yes.
And what were those dimensions, if you could list them again?
Oh, it will not be a comprehensive list, but like we have said, some people have a desire for truth. Some people have a desire for power, or a desire for lust, just fulfilling their bodily desires, or perhaps having a comfortable life without strain. And there might be more, of course.
Right. Yes, that's true. That's very true. Now, I would say, as I sort of argued sometimes, that even these different desires is fundamentally on a very deep level grounded in the desire for the good, and then they try to seek that goodness in different places, power or lust or other things. But yeah.
Yes, I think that's, yes, I remember that we have talked about this, and I think it's a good thing to bring up at this place. And probably this would be the point where Nietzsche's statement would break down, I guess.
Okay.
Or at least as far as I understand it at the moment. Sorry?
No, just continue.
Yes, because yeah, I think these different philosophies that different people hold that might contradict each other, like hedonism or the will to power, for example, they are deep in the sense that they encompass the entire all areas of life or all areas of human activities, but they are not as deep as a philosophy which encompasses all of these potential motivations for human action. Because all of them, I think Peterson called them like one-eyed monsters. They have only one eye through which they see the world, which is either power or lust or something else. But when you look at the different dimensions, and especially when you then start to even bring these together to a common source, like the desire for goodness, as you said, then I think it would, I'm not sure if this statement of Nietzsche would still hold, that behind the desire for goodness there is only the wish of the philosopher. I'm not sure if that makes any sense anymore to say.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what he meant either, but I speculate that he tried to ground all desire in some. It could be that he tried to ground all desire in the desire of power, that everything is fundamentally about power. Even lust and material pleasures is all about power fundamentally. I'm not sure, I'm just speculating. But yeah, I think he tried to at least reduce human action and rational thinking or reasoning to some set of desires or some fundamental desire. Whereas I would say, no, that doesn't work. You could say desire is always present, but our reasoning is distinct from that still. Yes, that was an earlier point that we talked about, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if all human action just comes from a desire, then that would in some sense be a justification for the will to power. Because if I have more power, then I can get what I desire better in some sense.
Also, the desire for power is always there implied in some sense, or what do you mean?
No, it's just if all human action only springs out of I think the problem with this thing is, with this statement that we are discussing, is that there are different levels on which you can look at a philosophy or a desire or an action, and in a certain level this statement seems to be true, and if you go above it then it becomes kind of ridiculous, like the desire to overthrow a government is just because sometimes I like to overthrow a government, then it's kind of a straw man. And then at a certain level the statement makes sense, like I have desire for material things or lust or a comfortable life or this or that, and so I need power in order to get these things. But then if you go even deeper, as we have started to look now in the end of our discussion, then you find that it again doesn't hold, I think.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying, that we have different levels of analyzing this. So you could perhaps ask, well, on which level is Nietzsche addressing? Is it on a very superficial level or on a very deep level? In the sense, for instance, that, okay, perhaps you are maintaining this position because you have some intellectual arguments, but the reason behind those arguments, again, is that irrational desire. Instead of the irrational desire being up here, there is sort of an intermediary between this irrational desire and the position, and that's all the intellectual stuff behind. So perhaps Nietzsche had something like that in mind, but yeah.
Yes, I think we will not finish this now, but it could be an interesting topic for a different conversation, this looking at a question on different levels, because I think what we have found now is that you can look at desire on different levels, and you can look at a philosophy on different levels. And I think, like, on the superficial level is not where Nietzsche's statement is set. I think it's set kind of on a deep, but not on the deepest level. So, because somewhere there is this level where the statement makes sense, where, yes, you can say, like, just, that's also, I think, a problem with many philosophers, that they don't seem to think in long enough time frames. They kind of think from the point of view of me as an individual during my life. And also in time, of course, there are different levels, if you want to call it so. And so in that sense, it makes sense, in that area, it makes sense that I say, yes, well, I have a certain desire, and then consciously or subconsciously, I kind of argue in a way so that in the end, I'm justified in doing what I want to do. But if you look even deeper, as we said, there might be more than one fundamental desire, and certain philosophies will encompass all of these desires, not just one of them. And even, as you mentioned, you could perhaps bring them together as the desire for the good, for that which is good, and then the statement of Nietzsche would no longer make sense, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, I think I'm getting what you're saying. And also I would distinguish between 2 points, sort of, because the first point is that regardless of what you think about human desire, motivations for holding certain positions are, it's important to recognize that the merit or logic of an argument or position is itself independent from any desire. An argument can be good or bad, completely independently of what human beings desire. So even if, let's say, you have a position that is rational and true, even if all human beings on the planet who held that position were completely irrational, even on a very direct basis, the argument could still succeed on its own merits. So that's one point to separate these two. The second point is that, yes, I would say that when it comes to human beings reasoning, when it comes to why we are reasoning, why we are maintaining these positions or thinking this way, desire is there in some way or another, either the desire for truth or the desire to want to present a position in order to make yourself become famous, because you want to have others look at your great skills of reasoning or debating, could be something like that, or confirmation bias or something else. And then you could talk about those being, again, grounded in a very deep desire for goodness, ultimately or fundamentally speaking. So yes, perhaps these 2 points can be summarized as there's a difference between saying, does the argument succeed, or is the position rational and true on its own merits, and why do you as a human being maintain this position or believe this argument? So there's one thing to treat of the argument or position in itself, and why we as human beings take into account that. So again, considering this in itself, it's purely intellectual. Considering human beings wanting this, the will is involved, because everything that concerns human action involves the will, and the will involves desire. Yeah.
Yes, very good summary, I think, of the most important point, or of one of the important points of our conversation here. That, and this would also mean that whenever one disagrees with another person on some statement or axiom or philosophical principle or theory, then there is this question to be asked. Either is there an error in my logical thinking or in the other person's logical thinking, or is there an error of the will, let's call it so, that I have a certain desire or the other person has a certain desire which hinders them from admitting or seeing that something is logically the case.
That's a very good point. I think that distinction is somewhat different from what I was getting at, but it's very close nevertheless, and a very important and valuable distinction.
Yes, no, I was thinking it's more as it follows from what you were saying.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying.
Yes, yes, and so I think we had now many interesting and valuable points in this conversation. I think it would be a good time to bring it to a close. Other than this point, which you have already summarized very well, I think one valuable aspect was the difference between a statement being self-evident and a statement being evident to someone. I think I learned something there. And yes, I don't know, other than that, one thing which was also interesting for me personally is the distinction between authority and power. I have to think about that some more. And I think those were the only two things that I wanted to add to the summary. Was there some point that you feel was important that we should mention in the summary before we close?
Well, one thing I could say is that the idea that all reasoning, or whenever human beings reason about something or maintain a position, it always involves a desire, but that can be on a purely legitimate basis if your desire is the desire for truth. I think that consideration was valuable. And also the distinction between an intellectual position being evaluated on its own merits, independently of what human beings are motivated by. That distinction is very important. And yeah, we made several other points as well that are sort of interconnected to other points we made and these points that we just mentioned. So I think this was a very productive and interesting conversation covering desire, authority, and power. Yeah, that was interesting. We sort of got into the question of when is it okay to revolt against the government, which is actually very separate from the question about human reasoning and desire. But since we use that as an example for our principles, we somehow managed to drag that in. That was very cool. So we sort of mixed two topics into one. Yeah, so that was interesting. So yes, generally speaking, valuable, interesting, productive. And yes, I would also say thank you very much, Amos, for having me on and have this conversation. So I don't have much more to add that I have in mind, but yeah.
Yes, no, I agree. I thank you as well for having this conversation. It was a little bit not known where we would end in the beginning, but I think we did find some interesting points. And yeah, so I hope the audience enjoyed it as well. And then I would wish you and the audience a good Friday and a good weekend.
Thank you very much. I wish you and the audience the same thing.
Great. So see you all later. Goodbye.
Goodbye.